In the Voice of Russia World Service, welcome to another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. Our topic today is fetal therapy and its innocent victims. In our overly progressive day and age, various rejuvenation methods with the use of abortive tissues are becoming increasingly popularized. The entire technology of so-called fetal therapy is based on the use of body organs and tissues of unborn infants. The Russian Orthodox Church and Society of Leading Orthodox Doctors have condemned such a method of rejuvenating therapy as a mortal sin, equal to manslaughter and cannibalism. The women, and perhaps men too, who resort to such therapy and cosmetics should know just how exactly the required substances for their masks and creams are obtained from the brain of an unborn infant. The appropriate scheme is outlined in the instructions regarding the order of obtaining permission for surgical interruption of pregnancy due to non-medical considerations. These instructions were approved by the Soviet government back in 1988 under Mikhail Gorbachev. Under these regulations, there were certain conditions when it was permitted to kill already formed infants. What were these conditions?
The death of her husband during the wife's pregnancy, if the wife or her husband were under prison sentence, in the case when the parent was stripped of maternity rights, a large number of children, if there were over 5 of them, a divorce during pregnancy.
There were a number of other reasons too. Let's elaborate on the concept of a late or overdue abortion.
The late abortion is carried out at 5 or 6 months of pregnancy, sometimes even later. With the help of ultrasonic equipment, the doctor finds the infant's leg and grabs hold of it with forceps. He tugs on it, thus extricating the infant almost entirely. Only the live infant's head remains lodged in the birth canal. Then the child's skull is pierced through with the scissors, which are then spread to expand the entrance.
However, the men and women who fear encroaching old age more than anything else will stop at nothing. In our age of rationalization, this brutality is fast becoming a norm. Officials holding responsible posts defend themselves vehemently from those seeking a ban on late abortions. Thus, director of the Republican Center for Reproduction, Andrei Akopyan, says, "The number of such overdue abortions does not exceed 3% from the overall number of abortions in the country." What murderous logic! It's like saying, "I only murdered 3, no big deal." comments Tatiana Shishova, president of the Family and Child Fund for Social and Psychological Welfare, and the fund's research officer Irina Medvedeva. Mr. Akopyan prudently failed to translate the small percentage into actual numbers. We shall do this for him. According to the official, quite underrated data, some 3 million abortions are carried out in our country annually. 3% translate into 90,000 infants, while only 1 million are born. So 1/10 of the annual nascent infants are destroyed through late abortions alone, not to mention the abortions on earlier stages. All advocates of abortions like to say that children should be welcome. However, from this premise, it does not necessarily ensure that they should be killed, while it is this demonic logic that is being imposed on society by so-called family planners. It is as much as saying every person must be happy, and on this principle destroying all those who are not. Meanwhile, abortions are particularly often the reason for divorce. The already mentioned scientists Tatiana Shishova and Irina Medvedeva write that in some countries of the West, the number of divorces started to grow alarmingly at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, when they legalized abortions there. In Russia, according to polls, over 90% of the broken-up families had an abortion in their family history. Quite possibly something in the union of two people breaks irretrievably when they find themselves accomplices in this crime. The wife cannot forgive the husband what happened, while the husband bears a grudge against the wife. In the past, women capable of taking their child's life was so rare that every such fact shook society. In connection with this, the Orthodox paper Cured by Faith cites the following example.
In Paris, on April the 10th, 1679, the Holy Inquisition convicted a certain Catherine Monvoisin. In her garden at Saint-Germain, they discovered 2,500 infant corpses and embryos. They had been bought for a pittance in the poor neighborhoods. Then a black mass would begin in an abandoned chapel. A certain Abbot Gibois reigned here. With merciless hand he poured the blood into a ritual chalice. The stomach of a naked woman served as an altar. This was a demonic parody of the Eucharist, the Christian Church, where it is customary to place under the altar the relics of saints, linking our world with the heavenly. Meanwhile, Abbot Gibois added infant's blood to the oblation for conducting a satanic mass. According to the formulas of black magic, infant's blood was used for the rejuvenation secrets of rich clients. They paid Gibois 100,000 livres each. For extending life, black magic, and afterwards science, always needed a corpse. In this distant 17th century, even the High Court of the Inquisition was repelled and shocked by Abbot Gibois' actions. In our day, there is a foreign medical catalogue entitled Calbiochem, where whole pages contain enumeration of the newest medical substances and drugs labeled human and fetal, in other words, made from man or embryo. The prices are mind-boggling, yet wealthy clients are not fazed by this, just as Abbot Gibois' clientele stopped at nothing to get what they wanted.
The paper Cured by Faith writes with indignation.
What is particularly outrageous is that the murder of an embryo isn't equaled to manslaughter. There you have the logic of the so-called humanists with all the ensuing consequences. These latter, incidentally, were not long in manifesting themselves. Contemporary human society exists in the following state: body without soul, science without morals, man without prejudice.
The paper recalls the year 1973.
At the time, a group of Finnish and American scientists extracted 12 live fetuses from the dissected uterus. These were placed live in a saline solution, so that the scientists could find out if they would be able to absorb oxygen. Back then, the world was already familiar with the results of an ultrasonic experiment conducted by the Japanese scientists, in which it was stated, at the approach of the abortion instrument, the infant in the mother's womb opens its mouth in silent cry. Alas, this cry was never heard by those rationalists, and those whose sense organs are stopped with the soft cotton wool of life's comforts.
The paper Cured by Faith writes with anguish,
Alas, the defenseless infants were at all times small change in bargains struck with the cruel gods of the hucksters. Today, this is referred to as lending one's child for the needs of science. Indeed, this is how they advocate the use of abortive material at the Moscow International Institute of Biomedicine. It sounds as obnoxious as making a sacrifice to Baal. Half of the stock of the aforementioned institute, set up in the early 1990s on the basis of the Center for Obstetrics and Gynecology, is owned by a certain American company, BioCell Studies. Since then, the organization has significantly spread, occupying a much larger territory. Its profits are growing too. Abortions are placed on the conveyor here. Prior to having an abortion, the woman must sign the following note. I hereby certify my voluntary consent for the use of my fetus and its tissues obtained through artificial abortion for scientific purposes, with their possible further application in therapy.
The paper cites a typical reply recorded on TV camera of a Russian woman who just signed such a note. I've divorced my husband and have no desire to bear his child. Besides, I earn very little and cannot bring up a baby. I'm still young. I will have other children. The respectable-looking and distinguished rector of the institute readily explains before the cameras that chiefly 16 to 20-week-old embryos are made use of. The fetus undergoes careful studies. Its medical condition needs to be ideal. The institute staff dispassionately place the embryos in a nickel-plated container inscribed biomass and carry these containers off for further reprocessing. In a super-sterile room, the embryos are sliced up into 27-29 fractions. Back in the times before ether was discovered, and the surgeons resorted to a stunning blow with a hammer, Dr. Paracelsus came up with a formula: treat like with like. At the International Biomedicine Institute, they insist they resort to this particular method. Thus, diseases of the kidney will be treated with extracts from the tiny kidney of a human being condemned to death in the womb.
It is obvious that man is displaying a growing ability to devour his own kind, writes the paper, informing the readers that there was a most unusual project at the already mentioned Institute of Biomedicine to use fetal tissues in the production of medicinal chewing gum. Happily, this kind of ersatz cannibalism did not come to be.
The existing in Russia Committee for the Moral Resurrection of the Homeland branded the described and broadly advertised method of rejuvenation as cannibalism no less, while the State Duma has already been presented with a draft law banning the method of fetal therapy from our medical practice. But it's no easy matter to push it through, since the advocates of fetal therapy are putting up a strong resistance.
The great writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, reflecting on the direction that humanity was developing in, conjectured that, in the final run, man would be left with just two rights: the right to universal coition and the right to kill his own offspring.
Decisions of the Christian ecumenical councils determined man is endowed with a soul already at conception. Sanctify Vasily the Great, who lived in the 4th, 5th centuries, assures that
one who destroys a fetus conceived in the womb is to be condemned for murder.
And St. John Chrysostom writes,
destruction of the fetus is worse than murder, since this is not a killing of what has been born, but an obstacle on the road of birth.
The paper Cured by Faith concludes,
the private life of a majority of contemporary people today presupposes a union where man and woman are not husband and wife, but partners in the love game. Hardly surprising that the result of such a game, the human fetus, is remorselessly discarded to serve the needs of cosmetology or pharmaceutics. The reality is such: fornication is always followed by murder. For the one and the other, both partners, shall be summoned to stand trial before God. This will no longer be a game. And those guilty of making such gifts of human fetuses to cosmetologists or pharmaceutists shall certainly have to answer for their crimes.
And there we end another edition of The Christian Message from Moscow, directed by Vladimir Dyomin, editor and music arrangement Tatiana Shvitsova, sound engineer Yelena Gashennikova, and your hosts Svetlana Yekimenko
and Pavel Novichkov. Join us for the next program in exactly a week's time.
All the best to you. God save you all.